Today's conversation brings us into the orbit of someone who has spent a lifetime insisting that public service can still be principled, independent, and deeply human. Russ Feingold's career has been defined not just by the offices he held, but by the courage he showed in them, often standing alone, often standing early, and always standing on conviction. From his years in the Senate to his leadership on issues of democracy, justice, and global engagement, he's been a voice willing to take the long view even when the political winds were blowing hard in the other direction. And beyond the headlines, there's the quieter story, a Wisconsin kid shaped by community and fairness and a belief that public life should be about service, not spectacle. So I'm honored to have you today. Russ, we worked together on some human rights issues, and I can remember press conferences with you. When we'd have a press conference together, we would almost inevitably, both of us, begin by saying, now, I don't agree with the other guy on almost anything, but on this we agree. So we do come from opposite ends of the political spectrum, but I always had the deepest respect for you and appreciation for your integrity, and I am honored to have you today. So let's start with the growing up years there in Wisconsin, what it was like, how it shaped you, and what it was that lured you into a political life.
Tim, first of all, let me just say what a pleasure it is to reconnect with you after a number of years. I remember our exchanges were always pleasant and interesting, and you were one of the good guys. You were one of the guys that was really upbeat, regardless of who the people were. So this is an honor to be on your program, and I'm glad you started this podcast, including the cigars theme that you have in the back. We weren't allowed to smoke anything on the floor of the Senate, but once in a while there might have been a cigar somewhere. Anyway, so how did it begin? So, my family came to Wisconsin. My grandfather came over from Eastern Europe when he was 14 years old by himself, and they ultimately found themselves in Janesville, Wisconsin, a Jewish immigrant family. And my father, he came with them. He was 5 years old. He went to kindergarten and he flunked twice, not because he wasn't smart, but because he could only speak Yiddish. And as I like to say, they did not have a very good Yiddish to English, English to Yiddish program in Janesville, Wisconsin in 1917. But obviously it worked out. He became a lawyer. And, as an immigrant family, as often was the case, we were very much on the Democratic side. But my dad really believed in public service. He did it at the local level with planning and working on getting nonpartisan judges was a big thing to him. And he imbued this with me so that by the time, and I like to kid around at our dinner table, there's two things you're not supposed to talk about at dinner table: religion and politics. And that's basically all that was discussed at the Feingold table. So as a result, one of us became a U.S. Senator, and my little sister became the first female rabbi in the history of Wisconsin. So
wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so boom, all of that stuff came together. And the big thing, though, is my dad always said that, he wasn't big on going into politics, but what he said mattered most was a person's integrity and honesty. And, he was a Democrat, but he had a lot of Republican friends, including, I remember when he passed away, most of his pallbearers were Republicans. These were just friends from Janesville, Wisconsin. So it was that kind of bipartisan, nonpartisan environment where politics was important, but it had its place. It wasn't in the center of everything, and people didn't, sort of despise each other. They generally got along.
Tell us about some of your campaigns. You had a kind of grassroots energy that was notable and successful. But are there any memorable moments from those campaigns and your political growth and rise?
Yeah. So when I first started running for the U.S. Senate, which was many years before, I was planning to run against U.S. Senator Robert Caston, a Republican. But, there were a couple of much bigger, fancier Democrats running. One was a multimillionaire, one was a congressman. So I was a real long shot. So I started years before just kind of floating around the state with friends, and we'd have a blast. We'd go up there and we'd stay somewhere, and we'd go meet some people. And, if you go to Superior, Wisconsin, you don't go to a formal meeting, you go to the Polish Club bar. And if you don't stay out with people till 2:00 in the morning, you don't cut it. So I went up there and we stayed out there and they never forgot it. Years later, people said to me, I remember you stayed out till 2:00 in the morning at the Polish Club bar in Superior, Wisconsin, which of course is on Lake Superior. So what I remember is it was tough going at first, Tim. I mean, there's 72 counties. We covered them, but nobody really knew who I was. I came from no famous family or real money, but we just kept doing the shoe leather. And one thing I found, Tim, was that people like food like I do. And so I would find the thing around their area that it was their specialty. Like in the Polish areas in central Wisconsin, it was kolaches, these delicious pastries filled with raspberry, strawberry. So
we didn't have a lot of that in Arkansas, but I've heard about it.
Well, we had every ethnic group you can imagine in Wisconsin. It was like a hodgepodge of mostly European. Now it's much broader. But anyway, I sort of did kind of a food campaign, but I do remember how hard it was to get going. We'd try to schedule a press conference in Milwaukee to get some attention. And this was during that horrible Jeffrey Dahmer trial, and the OJ stuff, or it actually was Dahmer. And so whenever we tried to have a press conference, there was some development in the Dahmer case that caused all the press to leave, even before I said anything. So it wasn't until the very end in August before the primary that things started to change. So it was a very long-term, very grassroots campaign, and frankly, it was among the most fun things I've ever done.
So you, of course, in your legislative activities, were very involved, one of the leaders, if not the leader, on campaign finance. I know you're very concerned about the influence of money in politics. Do you think today, I mean, you were a long shot, you were underfunded, and it was a retail politics kind of campaign. And is that possible today, or has money so affected the way campaigns are run that it's more and more difficult for someone who doesn't have name ID or a big bankroll to actually win?
Well, it's always been hard, but now it's almost impossible given the Citizens United decision and the huge amounts of money on both sides that are dark money. Makes it very difficult. I mean, it was hard from the beginning. Wisconsin had one of the only effective public financing systems in place back in the early 80s. And so when I ran for the state Senate, even though I had no money, I was able to get, a small amount of money from the state government to help me pay for it. So, at that point, people weren't saying, well, you got to be a millionaire to be a state senator. However, by the time I started to run for the U.S. Senate, people laughed at me. They said, you can't raise money for a U.S. Senate race. And sure enough, we did a grassroots thing. We did the best we could, but we had far less than our opponents. And frankly, Tim, it was only because my two opponents in the primary started beating the heck out of each other 3 weeks before the primary. It was horrible. And people look at who else is running. And so we did funny ads. We had Elvis Presley endorsement, even though he had been dead for 20 years. And people loved that. And so, I'm going to the parades and people say, hey, Russ, where's Elvis? And I say, well, he's back. He's right behind. He's coming up. So we used humor, and the timing was perfect. So we went from 9% in early August in 1992 in the primary. The primary was about 4 weeks later, and I got 71% of the vote against my opponents.
That's amazing.
That
That's really amazing.
To go against the incumbent senator who tried his own Elvis ad because he was freaked out by the humor, and people thought it was my ad again, so it didn't work. So we managed to win.
That's the great compliment when you're imitated. So.
That's not what he wanted.
So you served in the state Senate. What was the partisan breakdown in the Wisconsin Senate?
Very close. In fact, when I won, I only won for the state Senate by 31 votes out of 47,000.
Wow.
I was 29, and I defeated an 83-year-old incumbent and it was a very Republican district, but I defeated him by just 31 votes. And that gave us the 17-16 majority. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had. So the whole time I was in the state Senate, I think we were in the majority all 10 years, but it was very close. It's not as close now, but it was very balanced. But
Did,
party discipline was pretty strong.
yeah, that's where so did that. Did you find more bipartisanship and a willingness to work together in the state Senate as opposed to what you would discover when you got to Washington?
Actually, no. And that's the interesting thing. Now I think you would be very much more. But I would say that the Wisconsin legislature was less bipartisan. It wasn't angry, but people kind of stayed in their things. And so as you know, I was very independent. I caused more problems in the Democratic caucus than anywhere else. But you wouldn't have found really a McCain-Feingold type of bill, usually. But when I got to the U.S. Senate, it was amazingly bipartisan. People like various senators from Rhode Island, John Chafee, people like that were very, very progressive and willing to talk about issues. And it was sort of a badge of honor that you didn't always vote with the party line. And I had one of the most bipartisan records. But I do realize since 2010, since I was there, it's gotten far more partisan.
Yeah, it's changed. I think we would both agree. And I see senators all the time now who say, "Oh, be glad you're not here now," because they really regret the way how bad it's gotten. You have throughout your career and after you left the Senate, you've spoken a lot about civility and the need for civility in politics. And I have, if I can find it here, a quote that you made back in 2011. At Marquette University, you urged students to resist the argument culture in Washington. You said the most persuasive negotiators were those who combined passion with conviction and knew when to work out a deal. Your advice: stay civil, be humble, keep your word. So you still go by that advice? To me, that sounds pretty good. I wish we had more of that.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is now is that is apparently not valued as much. What I remember is people would start yelling at each other sometimes in the Wisconsin legislature. That almost never happened in the United States Senate. I remember one time that Ted Kennedy and Bob Kerrey went at it, and they were kind of yelling at each other. And I was like, wow, it was a private caucus. But people were very civil, even if it was phony, so there wasn't yelling and screaming, which, kind of was the way I was brought up. So what I would add to what I said back at Marquette, it's not even the argument culture. It's the anger culture now. And I realized I was defeated in 2010. And finally, I realized apparently people want somebody who's angry. And I'm not angry. And I don't want to be angry. I don't like the way it feels. So that's what's changed. I heard one commentator say that the person that gets elected to Congress now is the person at the county fair who stands on a soapbox and screams the most. And, that's not for me. I probably would not have gone into this career if I thought it was about seeing how angry or divisive you could get. The thing I loved about it, and this is why I so much enjoyed working with people like you and John McCain and John Sununu, is it's really fun when you realized you were going to do something together with somebody who, as you said, we always say, well, I don't agree with him about anything else, but it was a thrill. And I think for many of us, that was the best part about being a senator, is that feeling that we were being Americans first and partisans second. And that just seems to be almost gone now. And how are we going to get back? I don't know.
Yeah. I had a conservative Republican colleague who talked about going back and holding a town meeting, which most don't even do anymore. But he said they were screaming at him and yelling at him and saying he wasn't a conservative and he was a rhino. And he said, well, what vote have I cast that isn't conservative? And he said there was this silence. And then somebody said, it's not your votes, it's that you're not angry enough. And they were just honest enough to say the way that the sad situation that's the way most people feel today. So How much do you attribute things like social media and cable news to the anger that is so not just in Congress and in the Senate, but is characteristic of the nation these days?
Well, definitely the media and social media and cable and all that has created people into pockets where they get reinforced in the negativity and the anger. And if they're not in the pocket with some of the other people, they are less likely to be friendly to each other. I don't think it's just that, though. I think there's a lot of anxiety in the country, particularly in the more conservative areas, about how the country's changed ethnically, racially. And I think there's a discomfort that has caused some people to feel like, well, can't we get back to the way the country was in the 1950s? Well, that's never going to happen. And yet, I think many people feel isolated and feel threatened by people that are different, which I think is very unfortunate. But I do think that fuels some of this, and it gets reinforced in the social media and the white nationalism stuff that you hear. And, I'm shocked by it because I grew up in an environment as a Jewish kid where, I basically never heard anything negative about my being Jewish. They didn't like it that I was a Bear fan as a kid in Green Bay Packer area. I almost got killed for that. Yeah, there's some kind of weird discomfort going on, trying to get people to basically act like it's about football. Like, are you a Packer fan or a Bear fan, and not all football fans together? That's how it feels to me.
So that football analogy brings me to thinking about the Senate. Do you think there are, because we end up being two teams that figure out how we can fight each other, we strategize, and do you think there are any changes that could be made in the Senate today to make it work better and with greater civility?
Yeah, I've been working with a group of bipartisan senators through the Kennedy and McCain Institutes to talk about ways that you could try to deal with this in terms of some of the rules, in terms of amendments, to make sure that everybody gets to offer the amendments they want. That's the way it was when I came into the Senate. Not only George Mitchell, but Bob Dole. Bob Dole, all you had to do to say to Bob Dole was, I need to have two amendments. You didn't have to have it in writing. He'd just say, Russ, no problem. And he always kept his word. It became very different later on. And so I think that kind of an open amendment process, instead of filling the tree, which Democrat leaders were very guilty of, as well as Republicans, would be helpful. But I think in the end, it's up to the constituents. Constituents need to say the opposite of what they're saying now. They need to say, I will vote for you. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. I will vote for you if you'll work with the other side. And if you don't, I won't vote for you next time. It has to come from the people. And you know as well as I do, if your constituents are saying, Tim, you better get out there and show me that you can work with both sides, that's what you're going to do. The reason these people are so partisan is not that they really want to be. I don't believe that. I don't believe these senators are particularly bad people or anything. They just know they're going to get yelled at back home, get called rhinos and other things if they work with Democrats. And that's going to change on both sides.
On both sides,
you shouldn't be suspicious because you're working with a Republican. As you said, you and I work together in human rights. I think it might have been Tibet, for example.
It was Tibet. It was China.
Yeah.
So I was visiting with one of your Democratic colleagues who suggested that he was pointing out that the fact we have our party luncheons, Democrats get together once a week, Republicans get together once a week, have our luncheon, strategize on how we can best implement our agendas and so forth, that we ought to do away with those and just meet together. Well, I mentioned that to my wife. She says, well, there's two parties for a reason. I don't know that that's realistic, but I think if they even had once a month where one thing I've heard on the podcast interviews over and over is the greater need to listen to one another, that might be a means by which we could do that. I would like to see them think through some of that.
I think you just said it perfectly. We do need separate party caucuses, and fine if they're once, but I love your idea of once a month, the whole Senate gets together and has a nice lunch and has a couple hours together. I really believe that would make a difference. I hated it that we'd get herded into that Democratic room, and it had to be this way and that way, and some of the stuff was good, but this is what I remember with McCain, because John and I worked for 8 years on campaign finance, and both parties were mad at us. Both parties liked their money, so we're sitting by ourselves alone on the Senate floor doing our bill, and I said, John, nobody will sit with me in my caucus anymore at the lunch, and John says, me too. I said, why don't you and I should start having lunch together? Because I got yelled at by Hillary Clinton really loud. It was one of the only times I saw anybody yell. She told me to live in the real world when I was trying to get rid of that soft money. And one of my favorite moments of my career was the New York Times heard about this and wrote an editorial and said that Russ Feingold was the one that was living in the real world. Frankly, that made me pretty happy.
Well, you're right about John McCain, because he did have his own table in our caucus and had a few folks that would sit with him, but he was not always the most popular member of the Republican caucus, for sure.
I realize that.
You have invested a lot of time, I think, in your career and life in helping younger people. What advice would you have to a young person today, considering they look at the political environment and they're not very attracted to it, and yet they want to make what advice would you give a young person today?
Well, it's easier for an older guy to give advice, and I'm a little hesitant because the environment has changed. It's now got a real sense of violence to it. If I had ever thought that something could happen to me or my family because I'm in politics, like that horrible murder in Minnesota to the state legislators, I would have thought twice. But obviously people have to serve. And what I noticed, because I taught at many law schools and universities between 2010 and 2020, and I was president of the American Constitution Society, which had chapters in like 200 law schools around the country. So I've had a lot of contact, and there's still lots of young people that say, well, I'd like to maybe go into politics. And I say, okay, my advice to you is, if it's possible, like I'll ask them, where are you from? Oh, Lincoln, Nebraska, or Des Moines, Iowa. I say, go home, go back to where you're from. Because a lot of them are, they're at Stanford or they're at Harvard or where I was teaching. And I'd say, if you're not comfortable going home, it's going to be tough. And you need to go home with the thought that you might not be a politician, might not work out. But where would you go where you'd be happy? And so my advice, especially to Democrats, because I think they've forgotten this, is, you're supposed to represent the people. And you don't have to be from the place, but it sure helps. It made a big difference that I knew everything about Wisconsin and cared about the history of Wisconsin. So that's my advice. If you want to go into politics, be realistic about the risks of it, but also, represent who you are, who brought you up.
Good advice. Great advice. One of my early experiences in getting to know you that shaped my deep respect for you was when you were working with Senator McCain on the campaign finance legislation, and you knew you were looking for votes. You needed votes, and you made an appointment to come visit me in my office to talk about my concerns about that legislation. And I was so taken aback that a fellow senator would take the time to come and have an hour-long civil conversation discussing the concerns, the pros and cons. Boy, we need more of that. And I think that that example that you set really reflects what you mean when you talk about civility. So as you look back, and we kind of bring this to a conclusion, what do you want your legacy to be, Russ, as the sum of your career and your life of public service? What would you like it to be?
Well, first and foremost, going back to my father, is that I never embarrassed anyone in the family or in the state because I kept my integrity, that I was straight. That's number one. But also that I really tried to model the idea, maybe it's a outmoded, but the idea of a representative, of somebody who actually works for the people. And so that's why I went to all 72 counties every year and did a town meeting. So I did 1,200 town meetings, and I didn't set the topic. I would just come in, say a couple words, talk about one bill that I was working on, and just let people say whatever they wanted. And it was one of the best experiences of my life because I felt like, it's like the old town hall, only I tried to bring it to the work of a U.S. senator. And I felt because of that, that when I went to these caucuses and other places, I had more information. I had more anecdotes. I had more stories than other people about what people were really feeling because I had been there. And so to me, if somebody wanted to say, what did Feingold do? Well, he was a good example of what a real good listener and an honest person might be. If they can say that, I'd be pretty happy.
That would be that'd be a great legacy, and I think it is your legacy. Senator, thank you for this conversation, for the generosity, your candor, reflection that you've brought to it. Your career reminds us that integrity in public life isn't just abstract ideal. It's a daily choice, often sometimes a costly one, and always a meaningful one. So you've had some great stories behind the decisions you've made, the people who shaped you, and the convictions that guided you offers, I think, the kind of clarity that we don't get enough in politics. And it's a reminder that leadership grounded in principle, it still matters. And I think it still resonates. I'm grateful for your time, your service, and your willingness to revisit these chapters of your life today.
Tim, thank you for who you are and the way you conducted yourself in the Senate and otherwise. And thank you for doing this podcast. And we should share a cigar sometime.
I would love that. And I hope our paths cross real soon. Have a great day.
You too.